the elites are more than happy to sanction the Russians and say, that the Russians should be cut out from the global economy, but they're not willing to do the same thing with regard to China, and therefore Russia is able to do what they want because they have China as that relief valve.
How does a former general of the United States Air Force see Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Why haven't nations around the world sanctioned China yet, despite the apparent complicity? How does this war map onto China's threat to Taiwan? And what is the prospect of a nuclear war in the future, with Russia or China? Today, we sit down with Robert Spalding, former one-star general officer in the United States Air Force and senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, to talk about China's roles and interests in the war and how they are connected to the reactions of Western nations we're witnessing today. We also discuss the war's implications for the current world order and forthcoming choice facing nations under the military protection of the United States, yet maintain an economic partnership with the Chinese Communist Party.
General Spalding, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So, General, we're here to talk about what's going on in Ukraine and the overshadowing threat of the Chinese Communist Party. What's going on now fits your profile really quite squarely in both kinetic and non-conventional warfare. And kind of having worked with nuclear deterrence strategies and driven the nuclear warplane yourself, the B-2, and a PhD in economics. So you're quite in a good position to talk about this. Before we get into all of those, I kind of want to get your gauge on how this whole thing will turn out at the end. So yesterday, Russia took its first city in Kherson and reportedly ramped up missile attack on Kyiv, and around which Russian troops are still stationed as we speak on Thursday morning. And they're holding a second round of negotiations today. Tell us your reflections on the situation and the different scenarios that might play out from here.
Well, so first of all, you have to go back to the second Iraq War when the United States, faced claims of bogging down and the war not going well, and that was within the first 10 days. The war was over in 3 weeks, so a lot of that discussion was premature, and I think a lot of the same thing is going on here. People forget what the Russians did in Chechnya, and I suspect, and we're starting to see, that a lot of the same tactics that eventually were used in Chechnya to level cities are going to be used by the Russians. So I don't think the war maybe be going as well as the Russians would like, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that the Ukrainians are going to win. I think the Russians are going to keep pouring on the pressure until the Ukrainians have no choice but to give up. So that's my assessment of the situation.
And what do you think the repercussions for Putin is going to be? I mean, the sanctions are really ramping up across the world. So,
well, I mean, the real leverage point here is China. It's not really the Russians, because the Russians could not do what they've done without the tacit approval of China. So it just came out that China basically told the Russians, don't invade during the Olympics. So they knew they were going to invade. They just didn't want it to upstage the Olympics. And second of all, they've said that they're not going to join sanctions. So Russia needs to sell oil. They need to sell gas. The Chinese need Russian oil and gas, or some oil and gas. The question here is whether or not we're going to actually put economic sanctions and isolate China for their support of Russia. To the extent that we don't, the Russians have a relief valve. So while we think that we are putting pressure on the Russians by sanctioning the Russians and by, cutting off Nord Stream 2 from Europe, as long as they can get their relief valve through China, they're not going to, suffer, because they've already planned. They expected this. They built up reserves of their cash, and they had already talked to China about supporting them through this crisis. So this is a long-term effort that really hinges on whether the free world recognizes that China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and other authoritarian regimes have to be confronted and have to be isolated economically, or this is going to consume the world.
Right, and on the point of recognizing it, it seems obvious, almost too obvious, based on what they released, the joint document on February the 4th, which is filled with talking points on the two countries' authoritarian takes, right? So first, why haven't the West sanctioned China?
Well, the Chinese have done a great job. The Chinese Communist Party have done a great job of basically enlisting the elites of the free world. And so a lot of their wealth is tied up in this relationship with China. And so if you want to, essentially get a nation to do what you want, you have to put pressure on the elites of that nation. And essentially that's what China has done by entwining themselves into the fortunes of the elites. They're able to then push on them and lean on them, and this is the problem. So the elites are more than happy to sanction the Russians and say, that the Russians should be cut out from the global economy, but they're not willing to do the same thing with regard to China, and therefore Russia is able to do what they want because they have China as that relief valve.
And second question on this note, so given the world sanctions in place so far, would you say that China, watching this, would want to go beyond not sanctioning Russia and actually lend a hand to them? And if so, are they capable of offsetting the effects of the sanctions on Russia?
Well, given the fact that China is the supply chain to the world, so they have the manufacturing capability to support whatever industrial needs Russia or the newly acquired Ukraine needs, they're going to be just fine. Ukraine has a lot of resources. They have a lot of technology. They have a lot of capability for agriculture. So Russia is gaining an asset, and then China will be able to help them rebuild that asset. And so the combined Russia and Ukraine becomes a much more powerful country within Europe, and it's allied with China. So yeah, China has the ability to do it, and they're doing it. They're building a huge gas pipeline from Russia to China to ensure that Russia has the ability to continue to sell its energy. So this is a symbiotic relationship between two authoritarian regimes.
And how do you evaluate the world's kind of attitude towards China right now, as of this moment?
Well, I think there is, essentially disbelief that the Chinese could be supporting the Russians. And so most strategists are thinking, well, the Chinese don't want to get involved, but they're not necessarily helping the Russians. That's not true. If you're buying their energy, if you're not joining sanctions, you're in effect helping the Russians. And so while their rhetoric, the Chinese have used rhetoric to distance themselves from Russia, their actions actually belie that rhetoric. So, and I think what's going to happen is you're going to see that over the months and years to come, that the Chinese Communist Party will continue to support Russia economically, and that's what they need. They need an economic lifeline, and China provides it to them.
And on the part of the United States, you mentioned the part about energy, the interdependence of energy. What do you think of the policies on this within the United States at this point, and how does this play into the dynamic in Eastern Europe?
Well, look, we were energy independent, and then we decided to stop that, and, we actually buy Russian energy. So in many ways, our rhetoric is not matching our actions. So we have to fundamentally rethink how we approach the world and recognize we've entered the second Cold War. We don't have a statesman of the same, stature of, say, a Churchill. Churchill went to St. Louis, prior to the beginning of the Cold War, and said a great iron curtain has fallen over Europe. We don't have Western statesmen that have the courage or are not compromised through these relationships, these economic relationships with China. So it's a real problem, and quite frankly, it was a very good strategy on behalf of both Russia and China to bide their time, to wait for this infiltration to take place, and then to begin to create problems for the free world. People say, oh, well, we can't cut ourselves off from China because they make everything now. Well, that becomes a real problem if the requirement to continue to receive those goods is that you transform your society from one of a democratic society to one of more of an authoritarian society. That's the compact we've made with these regimes. And unfortunately, unless we're willing to confront that, and this doesn't mean that it's going to be easy. If we're not willing to confront that and the pain that comes along with that, then we're going to slowly just slide into this abyss where, rather than after the Cold War, where freedom won, that in this case authoritarianism will win, and you will see authoritarianism continue to grow throughout the world.
And would you say that China would be kind of the leading figure in that authoritarian camp? Because right now it seems like Russia and China are kind of almost, based on your evaluation, in alliance. So would you think China would be kind of the big brother of that alliance?
Well, they absolutely are. The same way that the United States was the engine of economic growth for the free world throughout the Cold War, the technology and innovation and productivity that came out of the United States really enabled Western Europe to rise up. It enabled the rest of Asia, the free nations of Asia, to rise up. And then those citizens of the authoritarian regimes within the former Soviet Union eventually rose up and overthrew their governments. And so I think what you have now is that China has most of the productive capacity of the world, and because of that has the allegiance of Western elites. And therefore, they are the leading protagonists in this next Cold War. And I think I would say right now, at least, they have the advantage. This is really, needs to be a wake-up call for the West to say, are we going to double down on the principles that, upon which the free world was founded, liberty, rule of law, free trade, or are we going to succumb to these relationships that we've created that bind us to a more authoritarian bent?
So I want to switch gear a little bit and kind of tune into the Indo-Pacific. At this point, many are mapping Russia's invasion of Ukraine onto the China threat to Taiwan. And given the recent alarm bell raised in the West by the invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions, would you say that Beijing's risk calculus have changed on invading Taiwan?
Well, what I would say about Taiwan is the same thing I would have told you about Ukraine. Putin made a decision about Ukraine. He's executing that decision on his own timeline. I think there's a lot of self-flagellating going on in the West, saying we could have done this or we could have done that. Absent having, left Ukraine with nuclear weapons with which to defend themselves from Russia, there's not really a lot we could do. So Putin was, he wanted to get Ukraine back. He felt the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. So we have to understand that nations do their own thing for their own interests, even authoritarian ones. And what I would say about China is they are going to do the same thing with regard to Taiwan. There's not a lot we can do to dissuade them of that. Deterrence, in a post-nuclear world means that if the adversary is nuclear armed and they don't fear the escalation to nuclear war as a consequence of their actions, then therefore they will feel inclined to act, because they will not see that in the case of Taiwan, they have nuclear weapons with which to defend themselves.
And what can you tell us about the prospect of China invading Taiwan? Do you think it will happen pretty soon before the 20th Congress, or maybe afterwards, maybe a few years afterwards, or?
And as far as timeline, I felt the Olympics had to be over before we entered this period where an invasion could happen. From here on out, it's anyone's guess, and I would suspect that, they have, some calculus, telling, and when I'm saying they, the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army, they have their own calculus, their own timeline, and they're looking for certain flags that tell them it's time to go. It's not, the West. It's not our actions that will drive that. It could be a distraction. So, having the Ukraine invasion continue to linger could serve as a distraction, or they could want to see things blow over with regard to Russia and then have it happen. I think it has less to do with Xi being elected to a third term. I think it has more to do with what's the external environment and what are they looking for so that they feel like they have the right conditions for success, for a successful invasion. The other thing that we have to consider is the Belt and Road Initiative, like Russia's lifeline with China. The Belt and Road Initiative is designed to be this economic, system that drives the Chinese economy in the event that they do invade Taiwan and they're cut off. So Russia, and with the newly acquired Ukraine and the vast riches of Ukraine and the rest of the Belt and Road Initiative, we become part of, not as tightly politically oriented as the Soviet Union, but very much the same as an economic and political order around this idea of authoritarianism. The question remains is how many democracies will be swept up into that order.
And I guess in an ideal world, what should the United States do as preventative measures in terms of Taiwan? And what do you see standing in the way of doing this?
Well, so I think in terms of Taiwan, we ought to be looking at the safety and welfare of the people of Taiwan. As you're seeing with Ukraine, if the Chinese run into trouble conquering Taiwan, then their tendency to up the level of devastation and destruction and death is going to increase. And so we need to be prepared to evacuate the people of Taiwan, those that want to leave. We need to be prepared to not allow technology or capabilities to fall into the Chinese hands as a consequence of the conquest of Taiwan. And then what we really need to do is to begin the things that we did during the Cold War. We need to invest in free societies, in our own society, in infrastructure, in manufacturing, in science and technology, in STEM education. And when we begin to do that and withdraw, and stop sending innovation, technology, talent, and capital to China and the rest of the authoritarian system, then you can allow the principles of freedom to actually show that they're better than the principles of authoritarianism. Ultimately, China's economy is less efficient than a free world economy. But the problem is, as long as they have access to the free world to get the things they need, the innovation, the technology, the talent, and most importantly the capital, then they will continue to grow almost like a tumor that is taking the lifeblood out of the free world.
So on this note, there's some theory saying that the United States should actually supply certain defense infrastructure, not offense, but defense infrastructure to Taiwan, for example, long-range missiles, in the event of what we just described. What do you think is the usefulness of this in terms of helping to defend Taiwan? And do you think it's that would be too provocative to the CCP?
I think short of that, giving the Taiwanese nuclear weapons, there's not much that you're going to be able to do to deter a Chinese attack. I don't think that anybody's going to advocate giving nuclear weapons to Taiwan. It's almost like the Cuban Missile Crisis. When Russia sent nuclear missiles to Cuba. So I think, and that could lead to nuclear escalation between the U.S. and China. So barring that, I honestly don't believe that there's anything that we can do to prevent an invasion that the Chinese Communist Party has said for decades is coming. They have, it has been so clear and transparent. They have said this. This is something that is in their plan. And we think because it's taken decades to materialize, that therefore there's some way that we can get them to, and we believed that maybe if they liberalized politically, that they would not be interested in doing this in the future. That's not happening. In fact, they've gotten stronger, and they've built the capability to actually effectuate that invasion and conquest. So it's coming. We have to be prepared for that. The only thing that we can do is make them pay the price by ensuring that in the future they're cut off from all of the benefits of the free world. And when they do that, and when they're forced to provide for their citizens in a regime, quite frankly, that disdains the truth or transparency, or really disdains the individual and individual liberty, that system will inevitably collapse. Now, how long will that take? Who knows? It took over 40 years for the Soviet Union to collapse. So this is a long war. It's not something that's going to be over next week or next year or in the next 10 years. We have to prepare ourselves for that. We have to defend ourselves. Nuclear weapons become very important in terms of deterring an attack on the free world. And then we're going to have to grow our capability, our productivity. American citizens and the citizens of other free societies are going to have better lives than the people of China and Russia, so that the people of China and Russia can see that the system that they're in is actually a prison.
Yeah, I think there a pretty significant amount of awareness for that within China. But that's kind of just my personal opinion. I want to get into a couple areas that you just mentioned. First of all, nuclear deterrence. So yesterday, the United States delayed a missile launch in an attempt to not provoke Russia, who has raised the level of nuclear alert to special combat capability. In your analysis, how likely is a nuclear conflict at this moment? Are we doing everything we can to minimize this possibility?
Well, I think the likelihood of a nuclear conflict between the U.S. and Russia is extremely low, and I think the reason is because both the leadership of Russia and the leadership of the United States understand the extreme devastation that comes from the nuclear weapons. The idea that stopping a missile test that is pretty much a standard test by the United States somehow contributes to lowering the heat with regard to what the Russians view as a threat. It's really, to me, it didn't really carry much credibility. I think the Russians are entirely focused on Ukraine. They're entirely focused on Europe, and they're not focused on some test going out of Brandenburg. Deterrence is much more, I think, steady state, and the awareness of where the United States is certainly going is pretty clear within Russia. They know that the United States is not seeking to get into a nuclear conflict with Russia, nor is Russia looking to get into a nuclear conflict with the United States. We've had these engagements, talks, SALT and START, the INF Treaty, all of these mechanisms to really understand the intentions and capabilities of both sides. So I think the understanding of both Russia and China in terms of what are the capabilities, intentions with regard to nuclear weapons of both sides is fairly well understood by both sides. What's not well understood is the nuclear capabilities, intents of the Chinese side, because we have not had those dialogues with China in the same way we've had with Russia. So I would say in terms of the threat of nuclear war, we have a higher probability that you could have some kind of escalation between the U.S. and China, merely because the Chinese have refused, patently refused to be transparent at all about what they're doing with nuclear weapons. They are increasing their number of nuclear weapons as we speak, and it's gone way beyond what they initially termed their strategy of minimal deterrence, right? They just needed the minimum amount of nuclear weapons to deter an attack on their country. They're going way beyond that strategy, and the challenge for the United States is we don't know what that means. I suspect what it means is that they want to be able to be in a position to be the nuclear hegemon and not have the United States as one. So I think, in terms of nuclear conflict or certainly confrontation, there's a much higher probability of that happening between the U.S. and China, primarily because of the stance of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, and I think this week an admiral from the military testified in the United States Congress, and he said basically there's an astronomical level of increase of the Chinese military in the last year. What's your reflections on this?
Well, not only have they increased the number, quite dramatically, the number of nuclear weapons they have have MIRVed ICBMs. So we demerved our ICBM. So we have one one warhead for each ICBM. They have 10 on their DF-41s. They've developed hypersonics missiles to include hypersonics that drop off, weapons on their way. So in terms of their advance, and by the way, those advances came with the help of NASA scientists and American scientists that were helping the Chinese Communist Party develop these weapons. So we've actually helped them develop better weapons than we currently have. And so absolutely, the threat from China in terms of nuclear challenges has increased dramatically just over the last 10 years.
I want to jump to another topic here, which is what it'll look like within the next few years for the world order. So the Trump administration had called on Germany to expand its military capabilities for a long time, and frankly aren't quite successful. But within a matter of days, Russia was able to push Germany to do this by invading Ukraine. And this seems like it's rather a reactive response from Germany. What's your reflection on this?
Well, of course, they reacted to Russia, but Germany and China are like a match made in heaven. So, the Germans have this incredible economic relationship with China, and I don't see that ending anytime soon. And so, again, as long as China continues to be the lifeline to Russia, even though that Germany has decided to now invest more than 2% of their GDP on their national security, and even though they've decided to cut off Nord Stream 2, the fact that they are deeply, deeply wedded to the Chinese Communist Party means that there's infiltration in the heart of Europe. Germany is the most powerful country within Europe, and soon to be Russia with the acquisition of Ukraine. So now we've got a problem because the most powerful economic country within Europe is so deeply tied to the Chinese Communist Party, who is the leader of the authoritarian system that is trying to overtake the free world. It's a tremendous challenge, and I don't see that it's changed much just because they finally woke up to what Putin was doing.
And so you're on the side that the Belt and Road initiative that China is doing in Europe, is that going to be affected by this whole thing, or do you see it's just business as usual?
Well, see, that's the real important question here. Will these nations, not just the nations of the Belt and Road Initiative, but Germany, nations like Germany, or nations like America and Japan, will they recognize that this economic tie to China is feeding the rise and spread of authoritarianism around the world? If they don't, then I think what we have to recognize is that the tools for digital authoritarianism are already embedded in the free world. And all it needs is for those, the elites of those societies to continue to double down on that system, the system of open data, the system of data collection, and then using that data collection to change the perceptions and intentions and behaviors of the citizens of those nations. So the tools are there. And certainly China and Russia have leveraged those tools over their own populations and increasingly over the populations of the free world. So the question here is, will we break free of that? Or will we just embrace, the authoritarianism because the elites feel that it's more in their interest in terms of their continued wealth that they don't fight what's coming from China?
Even with this consideration, do you see an increased effort for militarization among the countries that we mentioned around the world in the coming months?
Well, certainly Europe is arming up for Russia. Will others arm up for China? I think so. Japan is definitely making moves this way, and they're recognizing that Abe said, "Hey, U.S. needs to be much more specific when it comes to Taiwan." I don't think that's coming because the U.S. Doesn't want to get into nuclear confrontation with China. The wild card here is Korea. Is Korea going to, recognize the threat of a communist China on its doorstep, or is it going to succumb to the economic relationship with China? They do have a military, but it's mostly devoted to North Korea. Now, the rest of Asia, they don't. They want to be a security partner of the United States, but they want to be an economic partner of China, and so therein lies the conflict within their own societies. And I suspect that as time goes on, that they will, come to, lean more heavily on that economic relationship, and therefore, perhaps you'll see most of Asia turn, towards China. When that happens, authoritarianism is already going to be kind of embedded in the system that China has with them. That economic system brings with it a set of, requirements that you as a nation and your companies heed the line of the Chinese Communist Party, and if you don't, you'll be punished. And so I think that's already kind of embedded in the way that Asians think about the world, unfortunately. And we've made the problem worse by saying, sure, we'll be a security partner of you while you go and do your economic partnership with China, and not to say, no, that economic partnership actually undermines the security relationship that you want to have with us. And so we've allowed these nations to basically have a foot in both camps. And if we're actually serious about stopping the rise and spread of authoritarianism, you have to choose. And if you choose China, fine. But then you're going to have the PLA Navy to protect you. You're going to have the PLA Air Force to protect you. No longer will the American military be there to protect you, because we can't afford to protect those nations that want to undermine the free world with their economic relationships.
So on one end, you have this kind of authoritarian mercantilism coming from China, and the other end, you have the United States. Would you describe the United States' current status of, guaranteeing security around the world, from what we see with Afghanistan, from what we see with Ukraine? Do you think it's kind of almost backing off from the position of what they call the world police?
Well, I think it's a recognition that we can't be. It's unaffordable for America. Now, I think, coming out of the Cold War, or coming out of World War II, it was certainly in our interest to lend we and the Russians were the only nuclear powers. So it was certainly in our interest to lend our economic might, our productivity, and, the fact that we had nuclear weapons to those democracies. We did things like the Marshall Plan. We rebuilt these countries that had been devastated by war, because we felt like if we did that, and then, in concordance with the Atlantic Charter that FDR signed with Churchill in 1941, before the start of World War II, we wanted to build a world that was based on the principles of rule of law and free trade and individual liberty. These are the things that we attempted to do, and actually we're quite successful at doing, ultimately leading to the downfall of the Soviet Union. But what happened was, at the end of the Cold War, we said, Russia, China, all of these nations, come into the free world order, and you can partake of all the innovation, technology, talent, and capital that the free world has to offer, because we believed that would liberalize them politically. Didn't happen, and now we're faced with, the prospect of having to do that again.
I want to finish off by something really interesting that you tweeted yesterday, which you actually touched upon just now, which compared Western and Eastern strategic orientation. It said the West seeks to accomplish its objectives through voluntary and assertive action, whereby it's completely opposite with the East, with China, where efficacy is about deep strategy with constant adaptation to the circumstances, sort of like what you see with the chess game Go. Your reflections on how this difference manifests in the strategic landscape of China and the United States today?
Yes, I mean, I think when you look at the way that China addresses the strategic landscape and how it prepares itself, it's very different from the West. And the West has this idea that you can make the world into your image, and you can pick a goal in the future, and you can muster your resources, and you can actually make the world conform to your vision for the world. The Chinese Communist Party, leverages a lot of Eastern thinking with regard to What is the world going? Where is it going? Where are strategic trends heading? What do I see out there that I can take advantage of? And then rather than try to change that, how do I make myself conform to that and then be carried along with that flow? And so in the case of the Chinese Communist Party, there's two things they realize. Globalization and the internet would really enable them to take this idea of political warfare globally. And so if they just adapted, to those principles, understood globalization, understood the internet and this power over the individual, and particularly, how it would, lead China to economic power, that then all they had to do was orient their society around that, take advantage of that, and then be carried away by that. So I think it's a very different way of looking at the world, and I think it's something that we have to take into account when we're thinking about, what is the vision for the world that we would like to see. If it is one of liberty and justice and free trade and rule of law, then what are the things that we have to do to adapt ourselves to ensure that reality comes to light?
So you have a book that kind of talks about this aspect of the unrestricted warfare from China that's coming out pretty soon, right?
Yes, it's called War Without Rules, and really it's taking that unrestricted warfare that was written by the two PLA Air Force lieutenant colonels back in 1997, I believe, and it's condensing it, it's making it more simple to read, and then it's adding my commentary about that. And it's really letting people understand how, in particular, the way that the coronavirus played out, the use of psychological warfare, the use of fear, and some would say, the use of trade war and other elements of, national power that we don't typically think of. It's a real good, understanding of how the Chinese Communist Party actually used the things of day to day, the everyday, processes of life, financial, trade, investment, and in this case, influence in the medical community to create fear. How they blend all those together to create the kind of outcomes that favor, at least in terms of a power balance, the Chinese Communist Party. So it's coming out in April, and it should be a fairly quick and easy read, just like Stealth War was.
Right. And remind me of the name of the book?
It's called War Without Rules.
Okay, sounds good. I'll make sure to look out for that. General Spalding, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.